So let's start. So to begin with, please, for the record, state your name, education and occupation.
So my name is Yuri. I studied archaeology in Kyiv University, and since late October last year I worked in a history museum in Kyiv as a tour guide. So yeah, and then the war started and museum is closed for now.
Okay, so first question, a bit more openly phrased. Why is this war happening?
War is happening because Russian leadership started it, obviously. Russian leadership, it seems they are out of touch with reality, and seems like Putin was reading a lot of some pseudo-historical things lately, and got a bit carried away, I guess, and didn't realize the real situation either in Ukraine, either in respect to what Ukrainians think, how many Ukrainians actually support Russia, and he quietly, I think, also overstated the might of his military as well. So yeah, it seems like this, more or less.
So to go a little bit more specifically, there is a certain narrative presented by the Russian Federation and the Putin regime about why this war is happening, and it projects a number of excuses, but I would say the main, if we can focus on some of the very main ones, it's first about denazifying Ukraine. It's about protecting the populations, the ethnically Russian and Russian-speaking populations, particularly in the area of Donbass, where they claim there has been a genocide against them going on for the past 8 years. And finally, that it was a necessity for them to counter the ever-expanding NATO and the perceived threat from that expansion and its potential ballistic capacities and so on. So let's address this narrative, and one by one, and tell me, what is your response to the excuse of denazifying Ukraine?
Yeah, well, overall, I call bullshit on all of those arguments. One by one, about denazifying Ukraine. Ukraine didn't need denazifying, especially from the outside, in my opinion, because there were far-right groups. Some of them were causing trouble, but overall, Nazis didn't have much representation in political life, and their influence was diminishing over the last few years, actually. So about the denazifying, bullshit. Next, about what about genocide of Donbass people. This I would also call bullshit, because there wasn't genocide going on by all accounts, except for Russian propaganda, like everybody except Russian media, pro-governmental media were denying that the genocide was happening, and of course we cannot trust fully the UN or other international institutions, but they still have better data, and they still more trustworthy on this issue than the Russian government, and they all said that there wasn't a genocide going on, and actually the military action in Donbass region before the war, it was also quieting down a little bit, especially since Zelensky took office. So there were less and less victims over the years. This ceasefire, these Minsk agreements, they didn't always work, and there were certain breaking of those agreements on both sides, but more from the Russian proxies who are there. But overall, it was like a tendency for this conflict to kind of freeze down a little bit before the invasion started. About the expansion of the NATO, also bullshit. Because the only argument Russian side has about this is that the willingness to join NATO was put into Ukrainian constitution several years ago during Poroshenko's time, but on the other hand, it was mostly just a declaration. And NATO said repeatedly that they are not ready to take in more participants, especially considering Ukraine. So this argument is also bullshit.
Okay, let me go back a little bit on each of the questions. I was kind of planning to take them one at a time, but that's totally fine. Let's start again with the Nazi issue. There seems to be a lot of attention to specific formations and so on. Lately, I mean, obviously there's been the private sector, there's Svoboda, the various groups and formations, either of political or military capacity. But lately, the main point of focus has been the Azov battalion. They have gained enormous attention, and by many people's account, they seem to be, I mean, they are official part of the Ukrainian military, but also they are described as perhaps the most elite unit of the Ukrainian military, and with some of the most advanced equipment. How did we get to that point? How strong is really the Azov battalion, and how did it come to the point to almost represent the Ukrainian army in terms of media attention?
How it became the sole focus of media, it's probably has something to do with Russian state-owned media who function abroad, I think, because in Ukraine itself there is much less attention to Azov. And Azov was formed in 2014 when the Russian aggression started, when the Crimean Peninsula was annexed and the Russian proxies were starting the war in the east, and Ukrainian regular army was basically dysfunctional at that time, and so various volunteer battalions started forming based on either some previously existing political groups or some new, some totally new groups were forming, and Azov was formed on a basis of far-right organization Patriot Ukraine, Patriot of Ukraine, which was mostly its strongest presence was in Kharkiv before the war. And the core of initial core of its members, of Azov battalion members, were different far-right activists, some neo-Nazis, both from Ukraine and from other countries. But then this volunteer battalion volunteer battalions, they gradually over the years since 2014, they gradually were incorporated more and more into either internal ministry structures or armed forces, and they had less and less autonomy and Azov, which which is now like it's not actually technically it's not a battalion anymore. It's been a regiment for several years. And there was also the attempt by its leaders to create a political movement based on the Azov. There was a party registered called National Corp, and they didn't have much success electorally, and their influence was...
How much?
They didn't get into parliament actually. Not a single time. Like the leader Bieletsky, he was elected by territorial territorial district system in 2014, but he didn't attend many parliament meetings actually. So and during the next election he wasn't elected anymore. And so this national corp basically is basically politically dead by now, and I'm not sure, but I had an impression that this Azov as military unit and this political wing that they were drifting apart over the last years. Like the leadership of Azov is not the initial leader of Patriot Ukraine and of Azov battalion Bieletsky, but some other guy, and so they were not very active in Azov itself. Was mostly over the last years was mostly just a military unit. Part of it is based in Mariupol, where is the most fierce fighting at the moment, and so it. I mean, I'm not sure about this, but for me it seems that the Azov regiment now is mostly a military unit rather than some kind of political force. As for political views of its fighters, there are probably still many neo-Nazis there, but there are also, as far as I've heard, there are people without any distinct political views, and I've even heard from a friend recently that he's seen the guy in Azov uniform who was either black or Asian or something. Like he saw like very non-white guy in Azov uniform, so I guess maybe they kind of became more cool on racial issue as well.
There is also a little known narrative based on some journalistic and investigative reports that mention that there was in fact a mass exodus of Russian neo-Nazis in a previous period, before Maidan, before 2014, where, and it describes a tendency for collaboration between Ukrainian Nazis and Russian Nazis, and that they were trying to set up a kind of Nazi-friendly territory together here, and that this effectively came to a split in both Ukrainian and Russian Nazi scenes, let's say. What do you have any insight about that?
Well, basically, as far I'm not an expert on this issue, but in the late 2000s, there were some neo-Nazi groups in Russia, which were initially funded and promoted by Russian special services, such as Born, the fighting organization of Russian nationalists, which were known for several high-ranking murders, assassinations of political opponents, the most famous of which was assassination of the lawyer Stanislav Markelov and journalist Anastasia Baburova in 2009. And so these groups, these neo-Nazi groups, which kind of got out of control by Russian state, they were prosecuted, and some of former members or sympathizers did escape into Ukraine. Otherwise, in 2014, there was a big split and big breakdown between those on far right who did support Russian imperialism and those who did not. So like more oppositional and more pro-governmental Russian Nazis, and some of those more oppositional came into Ukraine, and. Otherwise, Ukrainian far-right scene also was cooperating a lot, not just with Russians, but also with some of European neo-Nazi groups, but mostly in forms of some conferences and musical festivals. There was one held in Kyiv, for example. Overall. So those Nazis who far rights who did stay in Russia mostly support this pro-governmental position, and still they do not have ability to somehow to perform in public space, to do something in public sphere, because opportunities for that in Russia were tightening over the years because of the repressive laws in Russia.
Some people I've interviewed have also pointed out that the Ukrainian far right and the Ukrainian neo-Nazism, although it has gained, or it has been presented in a more dramatic light due to the militarization of it, that it more or less follows the pattern of a rise of far-right politics throughout Europe, and they particularly mentioned in terms of more kind of proper neo-Nazi politics, Jobbik in Hungary and the Golden Dawn in Greece. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that the rise of far rights in Ukraine, even before the Maidan, was partly this part of European tendency of strengthening far right, but with some local specifics. I mean, in 2012 it was more obvious when far right party Svoboda came into parliament, and they had something between 10 or 12% of vote, so basically which corresponded a lot with election results in some other European countries. Otherwise, there was some local specifics, especially since the Maidan, because Maidan was a big and very important event which changed political scene a lot. For example, this Svoboda party mostly became politically dead after Maidan, because their radical rhetorics didn't correspond with their actions. And so they lost their seats in the next elections, and they I think they did manage to bring a few parliament members on this territorial districts system, but otherwise they didn't have much parliamentary representation. New groups rose since the Maidan, but based on their militant aesthetics and their proclaimed readiness to fight right police and later to fight Russian proxies, but electorally they were not successful as well. So otherwise, on a more grassroots level, there was big, I would say, rise of tolerance towards far-right ideas and far-right groups initially after the Maidan and initial stages of war on the East. It didn't translate into electoral success. It was mostly just some tolerance towards some of the actions these far-right groups were doing. Some people would condone them, okay, they trashed the art exhibition, but they're kind of war veterans, so maybe we shouldn't prosecute them very harshly. But this attitude began to change over the last few years. So general public started to be less and less tolerant of those things, which also can be partly explained by that the war on the east was de-escalating over this period. So partly it is kind of part of this whole European tendency of rise of far right, but it has some local differences.
So what is often referenced by people focusing on this Nazi narrative and the far right narrative of Ukraine is the presence of the former Interior Minister Avakov in the government of Zelensky. What's the story there?
The story is mostly Avakov. Before the Maidan, Avakov was a local politician in Kharkiv. He was, as far as I remember, the member of Tymoshenko's party, and he also owned some businesses, etc. And at that time, he did have, during his time in Kharkiv, he did have some connections with Beletsky, who was then leader of Patriot Ukraine, and later became founder of Azov. And those ties they were going on over the next years, and Azov was sometimes called the Avakov's private army, but it was never actually used like that. There were some business conflicts which were settled by the hands of Azov, and Avakov was overall hated by general public because first of all he was at his seat for too long, and he was a bizarrely resilient character who two presidents changed and several prime ministers changed, and Avakov was still in his position. And there was even a joke when the Game of Thrones finale was released, that I don't know who will be the king of Seven Realms, but we know for sure that Avakov will be the interior minister. And so he did have quite a lot of power concentrated in his hands, which was seen by many, including me, like a potential threat to democracy. But after all, he did step down because he became kind of too toxic to maintain. So eventually he stepped down, and being he himself was never actually neo-Nazi. He was a authoritarian politician with some authoritarian tendencies. He had some ties with the Azov, but how close were they? We do not have proper facts, so it's mostly just rumors and speculations. Overall, he was hated and protested against, and eventually he stepped down.
Going on from this, there is also some reporting on the relations on both sides, really, on Ukrainian and the Russian side, but in this case, in Ukraine, the relations between Ukrainian oligarchs and these far-right groups. What do you know about that?
Well,
I guess Avakov could be considered one of those cases.
Mm-hmm. Well, there were some connections. I mean, especially initially in 2014, when there was a bit of a chaos and these volunteer battalions were forming. Some oligarchs they did finance them because of their self-interest, mostly because they realized that Ukrainian political project and Ukrainian state offers them more opportunity than being incorporated into Russia. So they financed, some of them financed the forming and equipping of those battalions. Most of them didn't have like some far right position, not at least not publicly. I mean, there were a lot of members, a lot of volunteers were from right and far right groups, but predominantly there were still just most of the volunteers were still just people without any distinct political affiliations, and etc. And the battalions themselves did not have like proclaimed far right ideology, most of them. They were like several of these battalions formed, at least one I remember, Dnipro 1 was financed by Kolomoisky, who is one of prominent Ukrainian oligarchs, at least was until recently, and who owns one of biggest TV and media networks, and he's from Dnipro. He's of Jewish origin himself, and he's part of a Jewish community in Ukraine, and so there were cases when these battalions were financed initially, but it was in 2014, and later, like during last years, it wasn't the case anymore, because many of those battalions got either incorporated and put under the leadership of regular military or internal affairs units. Others were disbanded. Some were like there was Chernata battalion, and famous Chernata battalion, which was prosecuted, and the leadership was put in prison for torturing the civilian population in places locations which they controlled, and they didn't have, they were more of criminal thugs than neo-Nazis actually, because there were some few of them, like there was some guy, young guy, who was very media figure, because he had some very weird mix of ultra-NATO. He was originally from Belarus. His nickname was Mojahed, and he had some kind of strange mix of neo-Nazism and radical Islam, and like some crazy guy. But most of the leadership was like just guys from organized crime background, that they behaved this way, like it was very visible during court hearings actually. So overall, there were some volunteer battalions which initially were financed by certain oligarchs. Most of them were not far right in their overall, and the situation really changed since 2014 in that respect.
Another story that is often mentioned from sections of the left, of the Western and global left, that are somewhat more susceptible or even favorable to the Russian narrative, is about the prohibition of the Communist Party in Ukraine and other left-wing parties. And even more specifically, people are pointing, and in relation to the Nazi activity, the kind of mass murder of people inside that flaming building in Odessa. What is your take on this?
Okay, we should probably take it one by one. What was the first?
Because it was a kind of a communist union. That's
so
connection, but yeah.
About Communist Party. Communist Party in Ukraine was prohibited, as far as I remember, in 2014, I think. And Communist Party was they were not actually communists. They were mostly the leftovers from Soviet Communist Party, which over the years embraced more of pro-Russian and they mostly appealed to like all the people's feelings of nostalgia towards Soviet Union. Otherwise, they were pretty conservative. Their publications were overtly racist sometimes, and they had like they embraced Orthodox Christianity, and they were part of ruling coalition of Yanukovych's regime, and voted for some antisocial laws among other things. So they were communist only by name, basically, and they used some symbols, and otherwise they were not leftist at all. Other political parties of other left-wing political parties, I don't remember any of them banned before the full-on invasion started, and then some got banned during the martial law by the it's written in the law that while the martial law continues, those parties cannot function, and most of them, of those parties on the list, they were not left-wing. There was biggest of them was Oppositional Platform, which is the biggest pro-Russian party in Ukrainian politics. Led one of the leaders is close ally of Putin, Medvedchuk, who owned a media empire. And he was actually before the invasion started under house arrest for corruption charges, and then he escaped when the war started, and some members of this party actually openly supported the invasion. Most of them are not in Ukraine right now, and some of those of local members, they are now. I've heard about at least 2 cases when in occupied by Russia territories, cities, some members of this oppositional platform were actively collaborating and trying to form some kind of collaborative city halls, so the collaborative units of power now, and most of those parties who of the list of other parties were just political fillers who were brought up before the elections to some kind of steal the votes from other parties, etc., etc. So just not real political entities at all. There was one of them party called Progressive Socialist Party of Ukraine, led by Natalia Vitrenko, who was they were neither progressive nor socialist. Was mostly hardline pro-Russian party, which even more was based even more than former communist party on this socialist Soviet Union nostalgia, and otherwise they were xenophobic. They were spreading different kinds of conspiracy theories, etc., etc., and they were not not politically active over the last years because they lost all of their popularity, which they had in 2000s and 2010s. So most of those parties which were banned were not left leaning at all, and other ones were non-existent basically.
And tell me something about Odessa.
And about Odessa, yes. Odessa, this happened. It was, as far as I remember, May 2nd of 2014. So at the time it was a really tense situation in Ukraine because there was already some shit starting in the Donbass. And there were attempts to spread this into Kharkiv and into southern Ukraine, including Odessa. there was some narrative spread about Novorossiya, which was actually never a thing, which was just some old name for region, was just it was never like a single identity or something like this. And so in Odessa that day there were some pro-Russian rallies in the city, and they were concentrated like in local building of the unions. And at the same day there was supposed to be, as far as I remember, football match between football game between Odessa team and I think Kharkiv medalist, as far as I remember. And the support of those football clubs was predominantly like right wing or far right, and they had like a common rally in the city before the football play. And then some of the people like it's really difficult to discern what actually happened and in what order, because accounts vary dramatically. But by the main version, there were live shots fired from this football hooligans rally is going through the city, and there were some people from pro-Russian side who came to kind of counter protest, and there were shots like from AKs fired from that side. And then
from which side?
From the side of pro-Russian protesters, and then it escalated, and then there was a fire, and it was considered, and it is still considered as a terrible thing and a tragedy. There were 50 or so people died during 50 or 52 people died during the fire, and there were both like footage of people who tried to people from this football hooligan side who the people were jumping out of the windows, and there were both like attempts to save them by this pro-Ukrainian side, and some instances where they were like jumped out of the window and were beaten up even more. So I personally consider that this most likely was some kind of provocation to create this victim, this ritual victim to use in propaganda. But a lot of things are not clear from that events still, and now I don't know, I actually do not think about them much, because there was 50 people died there, and now its scale is incomparable of what is happening now, and it cannot be an excuse for bombing the cities at all.
So to pivot from that and the general Nazi Ukraine narrative into the Donbass issue. Well, first of all, there was recently an interview of a certain anarchist from Donetsk, actually, which is describing the People's Republic of Donetsk and Lugansk in pretty dark colors, and is mentioning a spectrum of stuff about what they did when they came into office, and how they criminalized homosexuality, how they brought back the death penalty, and he characterizes those people's republics as fascistic. What is your take on that?
Well, I wasn't there since the region since 2014, but seems pretty accurate, I think, and of course the person who's on the ground there knows better, but because I do not have like first-hand information from the area, but many of prominent members of leadership of these newly formed republics, so to speak, some of them were like just Russian citizens, Russian proxies. Other ones had some kind of weird mix of Soviet nostalgia, monarchism, etc., etc. So you cannot call them left-wing, even if you try. There were instances I've heard about from union activists about clamping down on unions in the region. And some of the guys actually, there was a funny guy, one of leaders of Donetsk Republic was Pushilin, or still is, the guy who actually was local, he's local, which is untypical for leadership of those republic, but he actually in a few years prior to the war, he was active organizer for famous financial pyramid of MMM, and there are even old videos of him like promoting this and like, yeah, everything is paid on time, so it's a good thing, come join, bring us your money. So many of prominent members of those republics were actually some kind of shady characters at best. And the guy who actually started, from whose actions the war, the combat actually started, Strelkov. He's a Russian citizen and former, or maybe former, maybe he's still part of FSB, as far as I remember. And he and his groups they deployed in Slavyansk city in Donetsk region in 2014 and started the actual like combat. And he has his views are. He has like some kind of this strange mix of monarchism and Soviet nostalgia, the one which can be described. His and many of his supporters' political views can be described as sometimes described as red brownish or brownish red.
And some of those leaders also had ties or were leading figures in far-right formations as well. Can you tell me about that?
There was from on the spot, I can from the top of my head, I can remember the guy named Milyukov, as far as I remember, who was like a Russian neo-Nazi, and they had like a military unit called Rusich. And the symbols were like this used by Eastern European neo-Nazis, kolovrat, which is like a swastika, but roundish and has more rays. And there were several other figures who with neo-Nazi background there as well.
And in regards to this Minsk agreement, concerning those areas, the Russian narrative is that, also partly as a subsection of the genocide and protecting the people of Donbass, is that this agreement was never carried out by the Ukrainian side, that they had to come in to like enforce what was agreed but never delivered, so to speak. What would be your response to that?
Once again, I call bullshit on that. Well, there were like Minsk agreements, and this Minsk process was pretty messy, and there were several rounds of negotiations and several agreements signed, but there were a lot of infractions of those agreements over the years from both sides, but like the independent observers have seen more of them documented more of them from a Russian proxy side actually, and it was like this Donbass area was a convenient tool because let's be honest, Donetsk and Luhansk Republic were not independent government. They didn't have their own agenda. They were mostly Russian proxies doing what Kremlin says them to do. And so for Russia it was like convenient tool to sometimes like before some negotiations, etc., to kind of escalate a bit. Like we've seen it several times over the years when we have some negotiations coming up, and then suddenly there begins like more active shelling from Russian controlled sides. And overall, yes, there were some infractions from Ukrainian side as well. Fewer, but they were fewer than from this Russian backed side. And in the end of this, about Minsk agreements, Putin actually buried Minsk agreements himself when he declared Donetsk and Luhansk republics independent. Which was like a huge violation and mostly like the end of Minsk agreements at all. And but over the last years, actually, this number of infractions of Minsk agreements, it was the whole combat was slowing down for the most part, except for some short periods of escalations. And the number of victims was going down and down over the last few years, especially since Zelensky took office. And Zelensky himself, he stressed many times that he doesn't see the military solution of Donetsk and Luhansk areas, which were controlled by Russian-backed separatists, Russia says that that Ukrainian side was preparing an advancement in that region, which we didn't see any hard proof of this. And I'm sorry, but Russian side is not very trustworthy because they kind of lie a lot. So you cannot just believe them on their word on this, I guess.
So, getting now to the NATO narrative, I would like to ask like this. It seems there is obviously a global discourse over what's happening, and one within the global left as well. And it seems that some sections of the global left, being used to opposing primarily American imperialism and NATO imperialism, they are focusing a lot on NATO's role in this, NATO's responsibility even, and on how NATO has been expanding and in some way has provoked this development. Now this narrative, what I find interesting, is getting a lot of pushback, or rather not just the narrative, but like the over-focus on NATO, rather than Russian imperialism being currently the aggressor in this case. So this is facing a lot of pushback from leftism and anarchism, particularly coming from any country, it seems, neighboring Russia, all the way from Finland to Kazakhstan. What do you think that means? What should that tell us?
Well, it tells basically that it may not seem like I understand that when you, for example, live in Western Europe or in USA, you see mostly the actions of American imperialism and which are to be condoned, of course, but in this region, those leftists, they sometimes omit the fact that there could be more than one imperialism, and on a regional level regional imperialistic power gets more attention and is more dangerous than some imperialism overseas, like the American one. And about expanding NATO. First of all, as we talked already, NATO wasn't going to accept Ukraine anytime soon. There were no indications of that. And the willingness of the people to join the NATO of different countries, it accelerates as Russia becomes more and more aggressive. So, for example, like when former Soviet bloc countries joined, it was like last of them joined in 1997 or 97, or
I think there was some of the 21st century as well.
Okay.
But anyway.
Yeah. So okay, I'll tell from Ukrainian perspective. In 2000s. There were some polls about general public. What do you think about Ukraine joining NATO? Because such a question is supposed to be put on referendum before it gets accepted. At the time in the mid 2000s, I don't remember exactly, but it was either like 50-50. Or even like more people do not support Ukraine joining NATO. Then after 2014, support among Ukrainian public to join NATO it grew a lot actually, and but it still wasn't like predominant opinion. It was still like something like 60-40 or something like that. And after this full-on invasion started, of course now more than 70% of the people by recent polls support Ukraine joining NATO. So popularity of NATO increases with escalation from and with threats from the Russian side, which is it's pretty obvious connection. I guess you can condone NATO actions in different regions, etc., but at the same time
condemn.
You shouldn't
condemn.
Condemn. But at the same time, world is a bit more complicated than that, and if somebody opposes the NATO, it doesn't automatically mean that it's a good guy.
And finally, my standard last question in these interviews is an open one, and it goes like this: given everything that we have just discussed, and given the overall broader context, the discourse of our discussion, what do you want to add? What do you want to say?
Well, there is this notion about denazifying this and all these rhetorics. And I just wanted to stress once enough that even Ukrainian state is by no means perfect. It had a lot of its issues and a lot of systems within state were not functioning properly, and actually now these grassroots volunteer initiatives they are often more effective than state organizations and big NGOs, denazifying. I mean, even if the end of the war wouldn't be like creation of anarchist society. Still, Ukrainian state, I would say, is more favorable than Russian one, because despite its flaws, there was like the atmosphere of freedom, and there were a lot of grassroots organizations functioning, and there was a big feminist and LGBT rights communities rising over there, since the Maidan, and sometimes its state is dysfunctional, but sometimes it's actually good for us because it allows more space for activity. And Russian state, which tries to denazify, has actually much more features of fascist state itself, because independent media are oppressed, and most of them, especially since the full-on invasion started, got disbanded or banned, blocked, and they face, the protesters face now up to 15 years in prison for protesting the war, or for not supporting official Russian narrative about the war, which they do not even allow to call the war special military operation, bullshit. So if God forbid, I don't believe in God, but if God forbid Russia prevails in this conflict, there will be no possibility of anything except for official state machine. Nothing will be alive here. It will be just eradicated completely, and especially considering the resistance of general Ukrainian public towards the invasion, they would be able to maintain the control only by the means of harsh repressions. So it would be like a full-on Nazi occupational regime, and so these are the Nazis we should be worried about right now. Most of them, like the Russian state and its military, more than small far-right groups which exist into Ukraine.
Thank you very much.